in places like California, it's up there in lights as to what this progressive ideology actually does. You force energy prices through the roof for various reasons, all the while saying that renewables will bring the price of energy down. You force manufacturing out, you kill your middle class, you end up with staggering, unheard of wealth and influence in the hands of quite limited numbers of people. And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that California is creating new jobs, but they're all low-paid jobs. The middle class is gone.
And they're losing. They were creating low jobs, but the tech industry, as you've read, is blowing up. So this week, Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter, and Facebook, they're going to be laying off tens of thousands of employees. They're not sustainable operations, partly because of mismanagement, partly because of the global recession. So a lot of people look, I guess that it would be analogous if you look at the EU today, and let's just take for an example, Switzerland was a member of the EU, and it had a free market economy, and it was less socialist than it is, and people were free to go there, and they all spoke the same language. You could see what would happen to the EU. People would be going in every direction. Leftists would be going to left-wing countries. Conservatives would be, if they had common ties. What prevents that is that these are separate nations. But here in the United States, we're creating separate nations, but of Americans that have common ties, and the common ties are attenuating as politics. And what that means is that when you look at the races in depth, the individual personalities didn't matter as much. For the candidates didn't matter. People were voting on ideology, party affiliation, politics. So you got a guy like John Fetterman that even people in Pennsylvania said is non compos mentis. He's totally unable to fulfill the duties of a U.S. senator, yet I'm going to vote for him because he is a one vote in the Senate that we need, or he is a Democrat, and they're going to stick with him no matter what. Debates don't matter anymore. John Fetterman was humiliated in that debate, tragically so. Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, did dismally. Carrie Lake, the contender for the governorship here in Arizona, where I am today, she tore up her Miss Holmes, her opponent. They didn't matter. And candidates just refused to debate, that was always the mark of a loser in American politics. They were cowardly. They weren't up to it. But there was no downside. They just said, we're not going to debate. And so everything that had been the particulars and the ingredients to winning or losing they're being airbrushed out. We're getting down to a hardcore, you're either with me or you're against me, a partisan ideology. And it starts from the left. And in reaction to it, a beleaguered conservative said, we're going to be doing the same thing. And then there's a final equation, John, that's very important. The way that an election is conducted in America today bears no resemblance whatsoever to the way it was 10 years ago in 2012. 2012, about 25 million ballots were cast absentee, or what they called in some states early voting. You could vote in a series of consecutive days. But all of those states that did that small percentage, had about a 5% rejection rate. That meant if a mail-in ballot came in, there were so few, they examined them very carefully. They said, the name is not complete, out. The address is not complete, out. The name and the address does not match the registrar's computer list, out. They forgot to sign their name, out. The ballot came in 2 days after, out. But when they changed under the cloak of COVID in 2020, these state legislatures, and it was just a very, very systematic effort funded by Silicon Valley to sue in the courts to say that this was racist, discriminatory. You could just have your first name. You could send your ballot in late. All of those variables were enacted illegally, and now they're all under appeal, and they will be appealed, but too late. The result was that the rejection rate in most states went down to 0.2, 0.3. That was a magnitude of 10. At the same time, the absentee ballots and early ballots went over 100 million. So you had basically, in the space of a decade, reduced election day and hollowed American holiday almost not officially, but de facto, into a construct. It was irrelevant. Only 30%, 40% were actually showing up on election day. And they used COVID to do this, and they were very adept at changing the laws. They had the money, the capital, the media, the influence, Silicon Valley, and the Republicans had no idea what was going on. They were still fossils who said, on election day, we get out the vote. We get cars and pick everybody up. We go to the polls and vote. And they have not mastered that. And it was very apparent in this election that these ballots, we don't know when the ballots come in. There's no such thing in America as there was in 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that on election day, people vote, and by 7 o'clock in the evening, till midnight, they find it. They go to bed and they know who won. People in America go to bed, they won't know who wins for a week, because these ballots come in at all different times. There are all different sorts of rules in different states, and it's an entire mess, and it's a real dagger to the heart of democracy.
Yeah, it seems to me there are two other problems. One is that very often a campaign can swing right at the last moment. In a genuine campaign, something is uncovered very late in the piece. Well, if you've had a whole lot of people who have voted already, many of them will then have buyer's regret, but it's too late. You know, that's why you have a campaign, having been involved in them, right to the end, arguing your case, being under examination yourself, having to rebut answers so that voters have the maximum chance of making an intelligent choice. The other problem is that it feeds into this great problem now in America, where it's very easy to claim fraud.
Yeah.
And that becomes a corrosive cancer on trust.
It does. And then especially when people who commit fraud or they're irregular have a preemptive defense that says, if you dare criticize me, you're a voter suppressionist or you're an election denialist. And we know what happens to you guys after January 6th. And then you add into, and you described exactly the fate of Donald Trump. He had a terrible first debate in the 2020 election against Joe Biden. He was rude, he interrupted, he thought he was going to and then he had a very competent, and a very clear victory over Biden weeks later, but 60 million people had already voted. It was irrelevant. There's two other things in the equation that are force multipliers. In Georgia, we have a 50% majority. It's a state, and there's a couple like that. You have to have 50%. So now the whole nation will be sitting on needles and pins why this one particular state says the winner on election day is not the winner and neither one has 50%. So we're going to replay what we did in 2020, where Georgia held everything up. And then we have this crackpot idea of ranked voting, where you list 1, 2, 3, 4 candidates, as happens in Alaska or in the mayoralty race in New York. So we have 3 or 4 competing systems in these states, and they're not compatible. And the result is that Americans are losing confidence in the integrity of their balloting.